2 weeks. That's all it took. Not 2 years of slow fighting, not 2 months of heavy bombing, just 2 weeks of Iranian cluster munitions. And now Israel's missile defense inventory is running critically low. The Iron Dome batteries are still standing. The David sling launchers are still operational. But the interceptors that make these systems work, the missiles that fly up to destroy the missiles coming down, are running out. And there is no quick way to replace them. This is not simply a logistics problem. It is not just a supply chain issue. This is the basic mathematical reality of missile defense. Every defense analyst knew about it. Every war game confirmed it. Israeli and American planners just hoped they would never have to face it in real time. Iran figured it out first. Here's the equation that broke Israel's air defense. One Iron Dome interceptor costs about $50,000. One Qassam rocket costs about $800. For Israel to keep intercepting rockets at the same rate, it spends about $60 defending against every $1 Iran spends attacking. That ratio was always unsustainable in theory. Everyone understood that. The assumption was that no enemy could keep up such a high volume of fire for long enough to make the math matter. Iran changed that assumption, not by spending more money, not by building more advanced weapons, but by changing the type of weapon. Cluster munitions do not care about Iron Dome. A cluster munition is a single delivery weapon that opens in midair and releases dozens of smaller submunitions across a wide area. Each of those submunitions becomes a separate object, and every object requires its own interception. A single cluster munition launch can force Iron Dome's fire control system to track and engage 30 to 40 different targets at the same time. Each one follows a slightly different path, each travels at a slightly different height, each arrives at a slightly different moment. Iron Dome was never designed for that. It was designed to intercept rockets that follow predictable ballistic paths, single objects that require single interceptions. The system's engagement computer calculates whether a rocket will land in a populated area. If it will not, the system ignores it. If it will, the system fires an interceptor. It is clean, efficient, and extremely effective against the type of threat it was built to stop. Cluster munitions break the assumptions behind that design. When a cluster munition opens high in the air, the fire control computer suddenly sees a swarm. It must evaluate dozens of objects at once. It has to decide which ones might land in populated areas. It must assign interceptors and fire them. And it has to do all of this in seconds, because cluster munitions fall quickly. The result is simple. One cluster munition attack can burn through more interceptors in 45 seconds than a normal rocket barrage would use in an hour. Iran did not fire more missiles. Iran fired smarter ones. And Israel's interceptor stockpiles started draining twice as fast as anyone expected. 2 weeks. Now, let's be clear about what critically low actually means, because that phrase appears in reports but rarely gets explained. Iron Dome interceptors are called Tamir missiles. Israel produces them domestically through Rafael Advanced Defense Systems. The exact production rate is classified, but independent estimates based on public contracts and delivery timelines suggest Israel can produce about 3,000 Tamir missiles per year under normal conditions. That might sound like a lot. It isn't. In a sustained conflict where interceptors are being used at the accelerated rate caused by cluster munitions, 3,000 missiles can be used up in weeks, not months. Production cannot increase fast enough to replace what combat consumes. Manufacturing takes time. The supply chain takes time. Testing and quality checks take time. You cannot simply print Tamir missiles. The United States does maintain emergency stockpiles. Israel has already asked for access to them. But those stockpiles are not unlimited. They were built for specific scenarios that American war planners believed were most likely. A 2-week cluster munition campaign that drains Israeli interceptors at twice the expected rate was not the scenario those stockpiles were designed for. And here's the detail that makes the situation even more serious. At the same time, the United States is managing its own Patriot interceptor inventory for possible commitments in Europe and the Pacific. Every missile the United States sends to Israel is a missile that is no longer stored for other emergencies. American officials know this, Israeli officials know this, and Iranian planners almost certainly understood it before they chose cluster munitions as their main weapon system. This is not an accident. This is resource exhaustion used as a strategy. The person who understood this best was not a general. It was an accountant. Any serious military planner who studied the numbers of long-term missile defense knew the economic reality from the start. Intercepting missiles is always more expensive than launching them. The defender always spends more per engagement than the attacker. In a short conflict, that imbalance does not matter much, but in a long conflict, it becomes decisive. Israel's strategic doctrine was never built around a long, direct war with Iran. Instead, it relied on deterrence. The idea was simple. The threat of overwhelming Israeli retaliation would make any long Iranian attack irrational. The assumption was that Iran would calculate the cost of Israeli retaliation, realize it was too high, and stop. Iran is not stopping. That means the deterrence calculation failed. Or Iran decided it could accept the cost of Israeli retaliation if the cost also brought a major benefit. That benefit would be the long-term depletion of Israel's missile defense system, something that could take years to rebuild. Even if Iran stopped tomorrow, even if a ceasefire happened tonight, Israel would still wake up with critically low interceptor stockpiles and a production system that cannot replace them fast enough to matter in the near future. Iran spent 2 weeks and managed to weaken Israel's defensive capability for the next 2 to 4 years. That is a strategic return on investment that no general's salary can measure, because generals usually do not think in those terms. Iran's planners did. Now consider the American position, because this is not only Israel's problem. The United States has sold Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Patriot missile defense systems to several allies. With those sales came an implied promise. In wartime, the United States would help supply interceptors for those systems. That promise has just been tested in real time during a cluster munition campaign, and the results are worrying. Every country that bought American missile defense systems is watching this carefully. Taiwan operates Patriot missile defense systems. Taiwan also faces China, a country that has spent the last decade studying the exact same problem. The question China has been asking is simple. How do you exhaust an enemy's interceptors before launching your main attack? The answer is also simple. First, fire cheap weapons. Fire lots of them. Force the defender to use expensive interceptors against inexpensive threats. Then, once the defender's interceptor stockpiles start running low, launch the more advanced and expensive weapons. China just watched Iran drain Israel's interceptor stockpiles in 2 weeks using cluster munitions. China also has cluster munitions. China has cruise missiles. China has ballistic missiles. China has hypersonic glide vehicles. And China possesses far larger numbers of these weapons than Iran, by orders of magnitude. If 2 weeks of Iranian cluster munitions could severely deplete Israel's missile defense, what would 2 weeks of Chinese saturation attacks do to Taiwan's missile defense? What would it do to Japan's missile defense systems that protect bases where American F-35 aircraft operate? The answer is uncomfortable. The reality is that America's missile defense architecture was designed for a world where enemies had limited resources. China does not have that limitation. And China just witnessed a real-world proof of concept playing out in Israeli airspace. Defense contractors will say production can be increased. Raytheon, which manufactures Patriot interceptors, will likely brief Congress on plans to accelerate production. Rafael Advanced Defense Systems will brief the Knesset about increasing Tamir missile output. The numbers in those briefings will sound reassuring. They should not. Missile production is not like automobile manufacturing. You cannot simply flip a switch and double output. Specialized components require specialized factories. Solid rocket fuel requires specific chemical precursors that... These systems require components that take a long time to produce. Seekers and guidance systems need extremely precise manufacturing that cannot be improvised quickly. The factories that build them are already running close to full capacity because the United States and its allies increased weapons procurement after 2022. There's almost no extra capacity in the system. If production of Tamir interceptors increases today, it will still take at least 18 months before those missiles actually appear in operational units. Increasing Patriot interceptor production takes even longer. That means there is a gap between what Israel needs right now and what the defense industry can realistically deliver. Combat does not wait for manufacturing timelines. 2 weeks were enough to deplete the stockpiles. 18 months are needed just to begin restoring them. That is the window Iran created, not by winning a battle, but by doing the math. Now consider what Israel cannot do right now. A critically low interceptor inventory does not mean Israel is defenseless. Iron Dome can still intercept rockets. David's Sling can still target cruise missiles, but the number of threats these systems can handle at the same time before running out of interceptors is now far lower than it was 2 weeks ago. This changes how an enemy plans its next attack. Iran likely has a fairly accurate estimate of how many interceptors Israel still has. Not because Iranian intelligence is extraordinary, but because Iranian planners know how many cluster munitions they fired. They know the approximate number of interceptors Iron Dome needs to defeat those swarms. From that, they can do simple subtraction. They know roughly what Israel has left. That means they can design a new attack. Not a small probing strike or a limited harassment campaign, but a large, decisive operation. An attack large enough to exhaust the remaining interceptors and then break through with a second wave. 2 months ago, Iran did not have that capability. Now it does. Not because it built new weapons, but because it spent 2 weeks draining Israeli interceptor stocks with cluster munitions. And Iran is not the only one watching. Hezbollah is watching. The Houthis are watching. Every Iranian-aligned group between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf is watching. They're all calculating what could happen if several of them launched a coordinated strike against an opponent whose missile defenses are running dangerously low. Israel's prime minister is now facing a situation with almost no historical precedent in Israeli military experience. Since the 1940s, Israel's security strategy has rested on two main pillars. The first pillar is offensive capability, the ability to strike first, strike hard, and end conflicts quickly before Israeli territory suffers long-term damage. The second pillar is defensive depth, the ability to protect Israeli cities from incoming attacks until offensive operations restore deterrence. Right now, both pillars are under pressure. Offensive capability has been weakened because Russia's S-400 Triumph air defense system can now track Israeli F-35 Lightning II fighters in real time. That development was reported 2 weeks ago, and it has not become less significant since then. Defensive depth has also weakened because Iran spent 2 weeks draining interceptor stockpiles with cluster munitions. This means Israel is currently less able to attack and less able to defend than at almost any point in its modern military history. Not because Israel lost a battle, not because Israeli soldiers failed, but because an opponent planned carefully, acted patiently, and used cheap weapons to create very expensive problems. The Israeli cabinet is meeting right now, making decisions under conditions that previous Israeli governments have never faced. Every available option looks worse than it did 2 weeks ago, and every option may look even worse 2 weeks from now if nothing changes. One possibility is massive American resupply. But that takes time. Ships move slowly, cargo aircraft have limited payloads, and factories cannot produce missiles fast enough to make an immediate difference. Another possibility is a ceasefire. But if Iran agrees to a ceasefire from a position of advantage, it will likely demand terms that lock in the gains it achieved during those 2 weeks of cluster munition attacks. A third option is Israeli escalation using systems that do not require air superiority, long-range cruise missiles or other deep strike weapons. And then there's the final option. It is the option no one wants to mention publicly. It is the one that keeps American officials awake at night. Because when a nuclear-armed country suddenly finds its conventional defenses weakened, when a nuclear-armed country with weakened conventional capabilities and depleted missile defenses faces what it sees as an existential threat, the strategic calculation becomes extremely dangerous. There is no clean solution in that situation. Iran understands this. Russia understands this. China is watching closely and taking notes. The interceptors are running out. Not because Israeli engineers made mistakes, not because American defense companies built weak systems. They are running out because Iran made a rational calculation. Cheap cluster munitions could drain expensive interceptors faster than those interceptors could be replaced. The math was always there. The vulnerability was always there. Every defense analyst who studied long-term missile defense conflicts saw the same conclusion when they ran the numbers. Iran ran the numbers too, and then Iran executed the plan. In just 2 weeks, the strategic balance in the Middle East shifted in ways that may take years to reverse, if they can be reversed at all. Iron Dome is still standing. It simply does not have enough missiles left to fully do its job. And the factories that build those interceptors will need about 18 months to significantly refill the stockpiles. Iran spent 2 weeks doing math that effectively took 18 months off Israel's defensive timeline. That is not just a military campaign, it is a masterclass in resource warfare.